The coach looked her dead in the eye, in front of the entire pool deck, and said, "Girls like you don't make it to nationals. You're taking up a lane someone else deserves." Ketura Boateng-Asare was 19 years old, soaking wet, and holding a stopwatch time that should have made him apologize on the spot. He didn't apologize. He turned and walked away. And for about 6 seconds, the same 6 seconds it would later take her to touch the wall at the Pan Am Games and shatter the Canadian women's 100 meters freestyle record. Ketura stood there and said nothing. That moment lived in her body for years, not as defeat, as fuel. Ketura Boateng-Asare grew up in Scarborough, Ontario, the second daughter of Emmanuel and Vivienne Boateng-Asare, who had come to Canada from Ghana in the early 90s with 2 suitcases and a folder of credentials that Canadian employers spent years pretending not to see. Emmanuel drove a delivery truck. Vivienne worked nights at a long-term care facility, changing sheets and holding hands, and coming home, smelling like antiseptic, her feet swollen, her eyes still warm. They were not people who complained. They were people who made lunch every morning before the sun came up, who kept the heat at 68 in the winter, and told the girls to wear sweaters, who drove Ketura and her older sister Abina to every practice, every meet, every early morning chlorine-soaked Saturday that any other parent might have skipped. Swimming was not a sport that came naturally to their world. It was not a sport that looked like Ketura, not in the clubs she competed with, not in the posters on the walls of the Scarborough Olympium, not in the names read out over the PA system at provincial championships. But Vivienne had taken Ketura to a public swim lesson when she was 7 years old, because Ketura had nearly drowned in a cousin's backyard pool the summer before, and something had happened in that first lesson. Something that coaches later called natural feel for the water, but that Ketura herself described more simply. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was flying. She was in a competitive club by age 8, regional finals by 11. By the time she was 15, she was the fastest girl in her age category in the province of Ontario. And coaches from 3 different clubs had expressed interest. The one her parents chose was the Lakeside Aquatic Club, out of Mississauga. The facilities were better. The coaching record was serious, and the head coach, a man named Raymond Stoll, who had been coaching competitive swimming for 22 years and who had a wall of plaques and a reputation for producing national-caliber athletes, had personally called Emmanuel Boateng-Asare and told him his daughter had the potential to go all the way. That call was the beginning of 4 years that Ketura would later describe, carefully and precisely, as the most important and most damaging years of my athletic career. Raymond Stoll was not a cruel man in the way that word usually gets used. He didn't shout. He rarely raised his voice. He was methodical, data-driven, precise. He kept spreadsheets of split times and lactic acid thresholds and talked about performance in the dry language of margins and percentages. In his mind, swimming was math. You either had the numbers or you didn't. What he had underneath all of that was a hierarchy, a ranking system that wasn't written anywhere, but that every swimmer on the team understood instinctively. Within the first few weeks of joining, there were athletes Stoll believed in, athletes he invested in, athletes whose bad days he coached through with patience and strategy, whose errors he reframed as data points. And then there were the others, the ones who took up lanes, who added bodies to the roster, who were allowed to train in the facility, but who received his attention in a different register. Clipped. Perfunctory. A glance at the stopwatch, a shrug, moving on. Ketura was, from the first month, in the second category. She noticed it before she had language for it. She'd finish a set and look over at the lane beside her, where a girl named Taylor, blonde, from Oakville, whose parents had been part of the club's fundraising committee for years, would be receiving 3 minutes of careful feedback while Ketura toweled off and waited. She noticed that when she had a strong time, Stoll noted it in his clipboard without comment, but when Taylor had a strong time, he said her name in a different voice. Not quite pride, something closer to ownership. There was a parents' meeting in her second season where Stoll distributed what he called development pathway projections, essentially tiered plans outlining which athletes were being groomed for which levels of competition. Ketura's projection had her capped at provincial. Not national. Not international. Provincial. Ketura Boateng-Asare sat in that gymnasium chair and read that document very quietly. Vivian read it beside him. On the drive home, neither of them said much. But that weekend, Vivian sat at the kitchen table and watched Ketura's race footage from the past season herself. Pausing and rewinding, and then she put her hand on her daughter's arm and said, "You are not a provincial athlete. Do not let that man make you think you are." Things came to a head in the fall of Ketura's fourth year, with the club, 2 months before Olympic trial qualifiers. She had spent the summer training harder than she ever had. Her times had dropped significantly. Her coach at school, a retired swimmer named Patrice Fournier, who had unofficially been reviewing her splits, told her that based on what he was seeing, she had a legitimate shot at the Olympic trials qualifier in the 100-meter freestyle if she could match her training times in competition. Patrice was not a man who overstated things. Ketura believed him. She went to Stoll and told him she wanted to enter the qualifier. He looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, just assessing. The way you look at a car someone is trying to sell you and you're already certain you're not buying it. He said, "You'd be competing against athletes who've been on the national radar for years. Your times aren't there." Ketura had her training log with her. She put it on the desk. Stoll looked at it, flipped a couple of pages, set it back down. "Training times aren't competition times," he said. "I know that," Ketura said. "I still want to enter." That was when he said it, not in front of the whole pool deck. That had come earlier, in a different context, on a day when she'd beaten Taylor in a relay simulation. And the team had gone quiet, and Stoll had pulled her aside and said it quietly, almost like advice. "Don't get too comfortable. Girls like you don't make it to nationals. You're taking up a lane someone else deserves." She had stood there, in her wet suit, and said nothing. Now, in his office, with her training log on his desk, she said, "I would like to enter the qualifier. I'm asking for your support, but I don't require it." There was a long silence. Stoll picked up his pen and said, "Fine. Your entry, your choice." He did not offer training support. He did not adjust her schedule. He did not give her the additional coaching time that other athletes received in the weeks before major competitions. He went on coaching Taylor, who was also entering the qualifier, and 3 other athletes on his priority list. And Ketura trained with Patrice on evenings and weekends in the Scarborough pool where she had started swimming. At age 8, the ceiling low and the lane ropes faded, and the water always a little too warm. Emmanuel drove her to every session. He sat in the spectator area and read the newspaper, and didn't say much, because he had learned years ago that his daughter didn't want to be talked at when she was preparing for something. She wanted presents. He gave her presents. Vivienne bought a new winter coat that year, and then she returned it because she said the one she already had was fine. Ketura found out later that the entry fees and travel costs for the qualifier had been expensive. Vivienne never mentioned it. She just said, "Go swim." The qualifier was held in Hamilton, at the First Ontario Centre Aquatics facility, on a Saturday in February. The pool was fast, 50 meters, 8 lanes, the kind of water that looks blue-black from the stands, and catches the overhead lights in a way that makes everything feel enormous and specific at the same time. Ketura had competed in larger venues, but something about that morning felt different, the air sharper, or maybe she was just more awake than usual, more inside her own body. She stood on the block for the 100-meter freestyle final and looked at the lane flags above the pool and did not think about Raymond Stoll. She thought about Vivienne returning a coat. She thought about Emmanuel, in the bleachers above her right now, in his good jacket, the one he wore to church and to things that mattered. She thought about Patrice, who had texted her that morning. "Your stroke is clean. Trust the water." The starter's signal sounded. 6 seconds into the race. Literally 6 seconds. A number she would be asked to recite in interviews for years afterward. She knew. She knew the way you know things in your body before your mind catches up. The way the water felt different when everything was right, when every movement was synchronized and efficient, and the wall at the far end of the pool was not a wall, but a destination she was already certain of. She hit the turn clean. She came off the wall with a push that she felt in her heels and her core and the back of her throat simultaneously. She came home in the last 25 meters with the kind of acceleration that the stopwatch would later confirm as not just competitive but exceptional. She touched the wall. She looked up at the scoreboard. Her time was 53:81. The qualifying standard was 54:20. There was a moment of complete silence. The kind that only happens in an aquatic facility when something unexpected occurs and the sound gets swallowed by the water and the high ceiling and everyone's held breath. Then the crowd in the stands, most of whom had no connection to Ketura Boateng-Asare whatsoever, made a sound that she would later describe as the loudest thing I have ever heard in a room where I was the only one who knew what it meant. She had not just met the standard. She had broken the Ontario provincial record in her age category by 0.4 of a second. She stayed in the water for a moment, with her hands on the lane rope, catching her breath. Then she looked up at the stands and found her father immediately. The only man in the building abreast was the only man in the building standing with his fists raised, completely silent. His face doing something she had never seen it do before. She pressed her palm against her mouth. She did not cry until she got out of the pool. Raymond Stoll was not at the qualifier. He was at a club invitational in Burlington that same weekend, managing the athletes he'd prioritized. He learned about Ketura's time the way everyone else outside the building did, through the online results database later that evening. He sent her a text message that night. It said, "Congratulations. Strong swim." 3 words. After 4 years, she stared at it for a long time. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen table and went and sat with her mother, who was watching television and had already cried twice that day, and was now very determinedly pretending to be calm. And they sat together without speaking for a while, which was something they were both good at. What happened after was not simple, and Ketura has been careful to say that in every interview since. She qualified for the Olympic trials. She competed at the trials. She did not make the Olympic team. She finished 5th in the 100-meter freestyle final, 1.5 seconds behind the top 2 qualifying spots, and for a 20-year-old competing at that level for the first time, 5th was significant. 5th meant something, but the story people want to tell about Ketura Boateng-Asare is not really about the Olympics. It's about what came next, and what came next was 3 years of meticulous, methodical work. A new coach, a program at the University of Calgary that recruited her specifically based on the Hamilton result, a sports psychologist named Dr. Lena Tran who helped her unpack what 4 years under Raymond Stoll had done to her sense of her own ceiling. It's about what happens when someone tells you that you are limited and you believe them just enough to feel the damage, but not quite enough to stop. At 23, Ketura Boateng-Asare qualified for the Canadian national team. At 24, she competed at the Pan American Games in Santiago, Chile, and won a silver medal in the 100-meter freestyle. At 25 last summer, at the World Aquatics Championships in Doha, she stood on a podium in a Canadian swimsuit and a bronze medal around her neck and gave an interview to a CBC journalist, in which she was asked what she would say to young black girls from places like Scarborough who wanted to swim competitively. She paused for a long moment. Then she said, "I would tell them to write down their training times, to keep a log, because there will be people who tell you what you are capable of, and those people will be wrong, and you need to have evidence. You need to have your own data, because at some point you're going to have to put it on someone's desk and say, 'I'm entering, with or without you.'" The journalist asked if there was anyone specific she was thinking of. Ketura smiled, the particular smile of someone who has been asked a question they've been ready for. There were several people who told me what I couldn't do, she said. I've stopped keeping track of their names. Raymond Stoll retired from coaching 2 years ago. He gave a brief statement to the Lakeside Aquatic Club newsletter about his career, mentioning several athletes by name. Ketura's name was not among them. He has not spoken publicly about her career. Ketura Boateng-Asare watched her daughter's podium moment from the living room in Scarborough. On a television Emmanuel had bought specifically for the occasion. Their first flat screen, a purchase he announced with such ceremony that Abina had filmed the unboxing on her phone and posted it somewhere. To much family amusement, when Ketura stepped up to receive her medal, Vivienne did not cry. She had used up all of that at Hamilton, years ago. Instead, she reached over and took Emmanuel's hand and held it, and Emmanuel turned his face slightly away from the television in a way that anyone who knows him would understand was not disinterest, but its exact opposite. After the ceremony, Ketura called home. "How did the coat look?" Vivienne asked. Ketura had worn a team jacket over her swimsuit on the podium. There was no coat in question. This was simply Vivienne's way of saying, "I saw you. I am proud of you. I love you more than I know how to say." "Perfect," Ketura told her. It fit perfectly. Some wins don't happen on the scoreboard. Some of them happen in a phone call from a daughter to a mother who once returned a coat so her child could chase something people kept insisting was too far away to reach. Those are the wins that don't have a time attached to them. Those are the ones that last.